The wagon train had been crawling across the Montana plains for 37 days when they found him. It was late September in 1799, and the aspens had turned the color of old gold against the dark pine forests that rose like cathedral walls to the west. The air carried that particular sharpness that comes before the first snow, clean and cold, with the smell of sage and distant water. 23 wagons rolled in a ragged line across land so vast it made even the boldest among them feel small. Thomas Bridger rode point that afternoon, his rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the horizon with the wariness of a man who had learned that beauty and danger often wore the same face in this country. He was 42, weathered as old leather, with a beard gone grey at the edges, and eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. "Thomas!" The shout came from Samuel Marsh, who rode the left flank on a sorrel mare. Samuel was pointing toward a dark line of pines, about a half-mile north, where the land rose into foothills that would become mountains if you followed them long enough. Thomas raised his hand, and the signal passed down the line. The wagons began to slow, harnesses jingling, oxen lowering their massive heads. He urged his horse forward, and Samuel met him halfway. "Smoke," Samuel said, though Thomas had already seen it, a thin grey thread rising above the pines, too straight to be natural. "Could be trappers," Thomas said, but his hand had already moved to check his rifle. They took 4 men, Samuel, Thomas, young Jacob Miller, who was 19 and eager, and Robert Hayes, who was steady and quiet. The women gathered the children close while the men rode north, rifles ready, eyes sharp. The smoke led them into the pines, where the air grew cooler and the ground soft with decades of fallen needles. The trees here were old, their trunks thick as wagon wheels, their branches creating a ceiling of green-black that turned afternoon light to twilight. No birds sang. That was the first thing Thomas noticed, the absolute silence. They found the den in a clearing where a granite outcropping created a natural shelter. The smoke came from a fire that had burned down to embers. Around the fire there were bones, rabbit mostly, some deer, cracked open for the marrow. And sitting cross-legged beside the embers, absolutely still, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, small-boned and lean, in the way of children who have known hunger. His hair was dark and matted, hanging past his shoulders, and his skin was browned by sun and wind. He wore what had once been a shirt and trousers, but they were so torn and dirt-stained they were barely recognizable. His feet were bare, the soles thick with calluses. But it wasn't the boy that made Thomas's breath catch. It was the wolves. There were 5 of them, all full-grown, ranging in color from silver-gray to almost black. They lay in a loose circle around the boy, not sleeping but watching, their yellow eyes fixed on the men with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The largest, a male with a coat the color of winter clouds, sat directly behind the boy, close enough that the child could have reached back and touched its head. "Sweet Jesus," Jacob whispered, and his rifle came up. "No!" Thomas's voice was sharp, his hand shooting out to push the barrel down. "Don't!" For a long moment, nobody moved. The wolves watched. The boy watched. And slowly, very slowly, Thomas dismounted, his movements deliberate and calm. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he took 3 steps forward and stopped. "Hello, son," he said, his voice low and steady. "We're not here to hurt you." The boy's eyes were dark, almost black, and they studied Thomas with an intensity that was unnerving in one so young. He didn't speak, didn't move, but something passed across his face. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition of something long forgotten. Behind him, the big grey wolf stood, and the sound that came from its throat was low and rolling, a warning that needed no translation. The other wolves rose as well, their bodies tense, ready. Thomas held his ground, hands visible and empty. "It's all right. We have wagons, families, food and warm fires. You don't have to be alone out here." For a moment, nothing changed. Then the boy turned his head, just slightly, and looked back at the grey wolf. What passed between them, Thomas couldn't say. There was no sound, no visible signal, but the wolf's ears came forward, and the tension in its body eased. The boy stood, and he was small, terribly small, all knobby joints and prominent bones. He took one step toward Thomas, then another, and the wolves let him go, though they didn't retreat. They simply watched as the boy crossed the space between wilderness and civilization. When he was close enough, Thomas could see that the boy's eyes were not quite black. There were flecks of amber in them, like firelight through dark glass. There were scars on his arms, old and white, and his hands were hard and calloused. "What's your name, son?" Thomas asked gently. The boy's lips parted, and for a moment Thomas thought he might speak, but instead a sound came out that was not quite a word, not quite a growl, something in between, something that belonged to the forest and the night. The boy seemed to realize his mistake. He closed his mouth, and when he opened it again, the word that came out was rusty and uncertain. "No," he said, just that one word, barely a whisper. "No name." "Well, we'll have to fix that, won't we? Come on, son. Let's get you somewhere warm." He held out his hand, and after a hesitation that seemed to stretch forever, the boy took it. His fingers were cold despite the afternoon sun, and they trembled slightly. As they walked back toward the horses, Thomas heard it, howling, long and mournful, rising from the clearing behind them, not one voice but five, singing together in a language older than words. And the boy, walking beside Thomas, with his hand still clasped in the older man's grip, tilted his head back and answered them. The sound that came from his throat was not human. It was too pure, too wild, too perfectly pitched to the voices of the wolves. It rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, like water over stone. When it ended, the forest was silent again. Jacob was pale, his knuckles white on his rifle. Samuel had taken off his hat and was turning it in his hands. Robert Hayes simply stared. "What in God's name have we found?" Samuel whispered. Thomas looked down at the boy, who looked back at him with those dark, amber-flecked eyes. "I don't know," Thomas said honestly, "but we're going to find out." They rode back to the wagons with the boy seated in front of Thomas on his horse, small and silent, and smelling of smoke and pine and something wild. Behind them, unseen but felt, the wolves followed at a distance. When they reached the wagon train, Elizabeth Bridger came running, her skirts held up out of the dust. She was Thomas's wife of 20 years, mother of 4, and she had the kind of practical kindness that had gotten them this far. "Lord in heaven," she breathed when she saw the boy. "Thomas, what?" He was alone, up in the pines. "Elizabeth, get some food and water, and find some clean clothes." "He needs a bath first," Elizabeth said. "Mary, Sarah, heat some water." But when she reached out to take the boy's hand, he pulled back, his eyes going wide. The sound that came from him was low and warning, and Elizabeth froze. "It's all right," Thomas said quickly. "Elizabeth, give him time. He's been alone out there for God knows how long." The boy's eyes moved from face to face, taking in the circle of settlers, men in worn coats and women in faded dresses, children peering out from behind their mothers' skirts. And then, from the forest behind them came the howling again. The settlers turned as one, hands moving to weapons, mothers pulling children close. But the boy simply stood there, his head tilted, listening. "They're calling him back," Jacob said, fear in his voice. "The wolves." The boy looked at Thomas, and in that look was a question so profound it made Thomas's chest ache. Stay or go? Safety or freedom? "You can go if you want," Thomas said quietly, crouching down so they were eye to eye. "We won't stop you, but if you stay, we'll take care of you. We'll teach you. We'll keep you safe." The boy looked back toward the forest, where the howling had faded to silence. Then he looked at the wagons, at the people, at the smoke rising from cook fires. When he turned back to Thomas, something in his face had shifted. "Stay," he whispered, barely audible, but it was enough. Elizabeth moved forward again, slower this time, and this time the boy let her take his hand. Her touch was gentle, practiced. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed. You're safe now." As she led him toward the wagon, the boy looked back once more toward the forest. Thomas followed his gaze and saw them. 5 shadows standing at the tree line, watching. The big grey wolf sat on its haunches, its yellow eyes fixed on the boy, and the expression on its face was one of loss and understanding. Then they turned, all 5 of them, and melted back into the trees. The boy watched until they were gone completely. "What are we going to call him?" Elizabeth asked. Thomas thought about it, watching the boy's profile. He said he had no name, but out here everyone needs one. That night, around the fires, they talked it over. Some suggested biblical names. Others thought frontier names suited better. But it was old Margaret Crawford, who was 80 if she was a day, who spoke the name that stuck. "Call him Silas," she said, her voice cracked and ancient. "It means of the forest. Seems fitting." And so he became Silas, the boy with no past, the child who spoke the language of wolves. But as Thomas lay in his bedroll that night, listening to the distant howling, he wondered if they had found Silas, or if perhaps Silas had found them. And more troubling still, he wondered what the wolves would do when they realized he wasn't coming back. The first week with Silas taught the settlers more about themselves than they had learned in all their days crossing the plains. They learned that patience was not just a virtue but a necessity. They learned that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt stone by patient stone. Silas ate the food they gave him, venison stew, cornbread, dried apples, but he ate it like an animal, crouched low over his plate, his eyes constantly moving. He slept under Elizabeth's wagon rather than in it, curled into a tight ball. And when anyone approached too quickly, his lips would pull back from his teeth. But slowly, things began to change. Elizabeth was the one who reached him first, through sheer persistence. She would sit near him while she mended clothes or prepared food, talking in a low voice about nothing in particular, the weather, the landscape, memories of Pennsylvania. She never pushed him to respond. She simply existed near him, a constant presence that gradually became familiar, then accepted. By the 5th day, Silas would sit beside her while she worked, still silent, but present. By the 7th day, he let her comb the worst of the tangles from his hair, though he trembled through the entire process. "There now," she murmured as she worked. "That's better, isn't it? You've got good hair, thick and strong." Silas didn't respond with words, but something in his posture eased. Thomas watched these small victories with hope and unease. The boy was adapting, yes, but there was something in his eyes that never quite settled. At night, when the wolves howled from the mountains, and they howled every night without fail, Silas would stand at the edge of the firelight, his whole body tense with longing. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the settlers were asleep, Thomas would wake to hear Silas answering them. It was young Rebecca Hayes, Robert's daughter, who first heard him speak more than single words. She was 12 years old, quick and curious, with her father's quiet steadiness. She had been fascinated by Silas from the first moment. On the 9th day, she found him sitting by the creek that ran parallel to their route, watching the water with absolute attention. "Hello," she said, keeping her voice low and even. Silas's head turned, and for a moment she thought he might bolt, but he didn't. He simply watched her with those dark eyes. "May I sit?" she asked, gesturing to a flat rock near his. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave, and Rebecca took that as permission. She settled herself, and for a long time they simply sat together in silence. "I miss home sometimes," Rebecca said eventually. "I miss my mother. She died last winter before we left Ohio. Papa said we needed a fresh start." Silas's eyes flickered toward her, something in his expression softening. "Do you remember your mother?" Rebecca asked gently. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No," he whispered. "No, remember, only them." "The wolves?" Rebecca asked. Silas nodded, and something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Pack, family. They took care of you?" Another nod. "Warm, safe, taught, hunt, taught, speak." Rebecca's breath caught. The wolves taught you to speak? To speak like them? Yes. He turned to face her fully now. They sing, tell stories, sky stories, earth stories, hunt stories. I listen, I learn, I sing back. Could you show me? Rebecca asked. Silas hesitated. But then he stood, and he walked to the edge of the creek where a fallen log created a natural bridge. He climbed onto it and tilted his head back toward the afternoon sky. The sound that came from him started low, almost below hearing, then rose in a smooth glide that seemed to pull the very air into its rhythm. It wasn't words, or if it was, they were words in a language no human throat should have formed, but it carried meaning. Rebecca could feel it in her chest, in her bones. It spoke of loneliness and belonging, of wild places and the creatures that inhabited them, of hunger and the endless cycle of hunt and rest. When it ended, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, from somewhere far off in the mountains came an answer. Rebecca's skin erupted in goosebumps. The answering howl was distant but clear, carrying down from the high country. And in that howl she heard recognition, affection, loss. They remember you, she breathed. Yes, Silas said simply. Always remember. Do you want to go back to them? The question hung in the air. Silas looked down at the water, at the wagon train in the distance, at Rebecca. Want, he began, then stopped, struggling with words. Want both. Want pack. Want you. People. Want. He made a frustrated sound and switched to something else, a whine, a whimper, a sound of confused longing. You want to belong to both worlds, Rebecca said softly. But you don't know if that's possible. Silas nodded, and the relief on his face at being understood was almost painful to see. Maybe it is possible, Rebecca said. Maybe you don't have to choose. Maybe you can be in between. A bridge. Bridge, Silas repeated, testing the word. Between. Yes, between the wolves and us, between wild and tame. Something in Silas's face shifted, and for the first time since they'd found him, he smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. Bridge, he said again, and this time it sounded like hope. They walked back to the wagons together, and Rebecca told him about Ohio, about her mother's garden and her father's forge. Silas listened with complete attention. When they reached the camp, they found the settlers gathered in a tight cluster, their voices low and worried. Thomas stood at the center, and when he saw Rebecca and Silas, some of the tension in his shoulders eased. There you are. Rebecca, stay close to the wagons from now on. Silas, son, we need to talk. What's wrong? Rebecca asked. Thomas gestured toward the forest. They're getting closer. The wolves. Every night they come a little nearer. Last night Samuel saw them at the edge of the firelight, 5 of them just watching. They want him back, Jacob said, accusation in his voice. They're not going to let him stay. We don't know that, Elizabeth said sharply. They haven't shown any aggression yet, Jacob interrupted. But what happens when they decide to take him? They won't, Silas said, and every head turned toward him, startled by the certainty in his voice. How do you know? Thomas asked gently. Silas looked toward the forest. They protect, watch, make sure, safe. They no take. They wait. Wait for what? Samuel asked. Wait for me choose. The silence that followed was profound. The settlers looked at each other, then at the boy. And what will you choose? Thomas asked quietly. Silas looked at him, then at Elizabeth, then at Rebecca, and finally back at the forest. Not no, not ready, choose. That night the wolves came closer than ever before. Thomas woke to the sound of growling, low, sustained, coming from multiple throats. He grabbed his rifle and stumbled out to find half the camp already awake, weapons in hand. And there, just at the edge of visibility, they stood. 5 wolves, silver and grey and black, their eyes catching the firelight. The big grey male stood at the front, his head held high, radiating authority and warning. Don't shoot, Thomas ordered. Nobody shoot unless they attack. The wolves didn't attack. They simply stood there, watching. He turned and saw Silas standing in the open, halfway between the wagons and the wolves, his small body backlit by the fire. "Silas," Elizabeth called, fear in her voice. "Come back here." But Silas didn't move. He stood frozen, caught between the two forces that pulled at him. The big grey wolf took one step forward, then another. Rifles came up, hammers cocked back. "Hold!" Thomas commanded. The wolf stopped 5 feet from Silas and sat, its tail curled around its feet, its eyes level with the boys. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Silas did something that made every person in the camp hold their breath. He reached out and placed his hand on the wolf's head. The wolf leaned into the touch, its eyes closing briefly, and a sound came from its throat that spoke of recognition and loss and acceptance. Silas leaned forward until his forehead rested against the wolf's, and they stayed that way for a long moment. When Silas pulled back, his face was wet with tears, the first tears anyone had seen him shed. "Go," he whispered to the wolf. "I stay. I bridge. I remember. Always remember." The wolf stood, and it looked at Silas with eyes that held more intelligence than any animal should possess. Then it looked past him, at the settlers with their weapons and their fear and their fragile hope, and something in its gaze seemed to make a judgment. It turned and walked back toward the tree line, and the other 4 wolves fell into step behind it. Just before they disappeared, the big grey stopped and looked back. Then it tilted its head back and howled, a sound so mournful, so full of loss and love and farewell, that it brought tears to weathered eyes. And Silas, standing alone in the space between the wagons and the wilderness, tilted his head back and answered, not with the wild, perfect mimicry he had used before, but with something new, something that was part human and part wolf, part civilization and part wilderness. It was the voice of a bridge between worlds. When the wolves were gone and the night was silent again, Silas turned and walked back. He walked past Thomas and Elizabeth, past the settlers with their rifles and their questions, and he went straight to Rebecca. "Bridge," he said to her, his voice stronger now. "I bridge." Rebecca nodded, unable to speak, and she took his hand. That night, Silas slept under the wagon as always, but for the first time he didn't curl into a defensive ball. He lay on his back, looking up at the stars, and when Elizabeth checked on him before dawn, she found him smiling in his sleep. The wolves didn't come to the edge of camp again, but every evening at twilight their howls would drift down from the mountains, and every evening Silas would stand at the edge of the firelight and answer them. And slowly, day by day, word by word, the boy who spoke the language of wolves began to learn the language of men. October gave way to November, and the Montana sky turned the color of old iron. The wagon train pushed westward through increasingly difficult terrain, following a route that Thomas hoped would lead them to a valley where they could establish a settlement before winter arrived. The aspens had dropped their leaves, leaving skeletal fingers clawing at the sky, and the pines seemed to grow darker as the days shortened. Silas changed with the season. His English improved steadily under Elizabeth's patient tutelage and Rebecca's constant companionship. He learned the names for things: wagon, fire, bread, horse, sky, and began to string them into simple sentences that grew more complex each day. He learned to wear the clothes they gave him without pulling at them constantly, learned to sleep through the night, learned to sit at the fire with the others. But there was a restlessness in him that the approaching winter seemed to amplify. He would stand for hours watching the mountains, his body tense with longing. At night his dreams were troubled, and more than once Elizabeth woke to find him standing outside in the cold, his face turned toward the high country. "He's struggling," Rebecca said to her father one evening. "Part of him is still up there with them." Robert Hayes looked at his daughter with surprise. At 12, she was already showing perception most people took decades to develop. "Yes, but part of him is here too. The question is which part will win. Maybe both can win," Rebecca said. "Maybe he doesn't have to choose. Life usually makes us choose, Robert said gently. But maybe you're right. Maybe he's different. The first test came on a grey morning when the wind carried the smell of snow. They had stopped to rest the oxen and repair a broken wheel when young Timothy Foster came running into camp, his face white with panic. "Wolves!" he shouted. "Wolves attacking the cattle!" The reaction was immediate. Men grabbed rifles, women pulled children close, and everyone turned toward the makeshift corral where they'd penned the cattle. Thomas ran toward the sound of panicked lowing and found carnage. 3 wolves, not the pack that had been following them, but different ones, wilder, with eyes that held only hunger, had gotten among the cattle. One cow was already down, its throat torn open, blood steaming in the cold air. 2 more were injured, stumbling in circles. The wolves turned at the approach of the men, their muzzles dark with blood, their bodies tense and ready. These were not the cautious animals that had watched Silas. These were killers, desperate and dangerous, driven by starvation. Thomas raised his rifle, and beside him Samuel and Jacob did the same. The wolves crouched low, preparing to either flee or attack. And then Silas was there. He had run from the wagons so fast no one had seen him coming, and he pushed between the men and the wolves before anyone could stop him. His hands were out, palms forward, and the sound that came from his throat was sharp and commanding. A bark, a growl, something that carried unmistakable authority. The wolves froze. "Silas, get back!" Thomas shouted, but the boy didn't move. He stood his ground, this small child who barely came up to Thomas's chest, and he faced down 3 full-grown wolves with nothing but the language he had learned in a different life. The sounds that came from him were complex, layered, not just growls, but a full vocabulary of whines, barks, and subtle vocalizations that shifted in pitch and rhythm. He was speaking to them, actually speaking, in a language that predated human words by millennia. The wolves listened, their ears forward, their bodies losing some of their tension. The largest of the 3, a female with a scarred muzzle and ribs showing through her coat, made a sound back, something between a whine and a growl. Silas responded, his voice dropping to something softer, almost gentle. He gestured toward the forest, toward the mountains, his meaning clear. Go, leave. For a long moment the outcome hung in the balance. The settlers held their breath, rifles ready but not raised. Then slowly, the scarred female backed away from the dead cow. The other 2 followed her lead, their eyes still fixed on Silas, their bodies low and submissive. They retreated to the tree line, and just before they disappeared, the female looked back at Silas. She dipped her head, just once, just slightly, in what could only be described as acknowledgement. Then they were gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas turned back to the settlers, and his face was pale, his hands trembling. "They hungry," he said. "No food in mountain. Snow come early. They desperate." "You could have been killed," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. "Silas, you can't just—" "Had to," Silas interrupted. "They not understand you. Shoot them, more come. I make understand. Cattle, not for wolves. Find other food." "Did they understand?" Thomas asked quietly. Silas nodded. "They go, not come back." "How can you be sure?" "I promise them, say, I find food. Leave. For them, away from camp. They trust me." The implications were staggering. The settlers looked at each other, trying to process what they had witnessed. This boy had just negotiated a truce with wild animals using a language none of them had known could exist. "What did you promise them?" Thomas asked. "Scraps, bones, things we not eat. I leave, in forest. They take, no need, hunt cattle." It was Samuel who voiced what others were thinking. "That's assuming they honor the agreement." "They honor," Silas said with absolute certainty. "Wolves, keep word, better than people." There was an uncomfortable silence. "All right," Thomas said finally. "We'll try it your way, Silas. But if they come back—" "They won't," Silas said. "I promise you." That night, Silas gathered the scraps from the evening meal and carried them into the forest alone, despite Elizabeth's protests. Rebecca watched him go, her heart in her throat, and when he returned an hour later, she was waiting. "Did you find them?" she asked. He nodded. "Left food. They... grateful. Say thank you." "They can say thank you?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not words, but yes, they understand." The second test came a week later, when the first real snow began to fall. They woke to a world transformed. The landscape softened under a blanket of white. The temperature had dropped dramatically overnight, and ice formed on the water barrels. Thomas called a meeting of the men to discuss their options. Winter was coming faster than anticipated, and they were still at least 2 weeks from the valley where they hoped to settle. The question was whether to push on and risk being caught in heavy snow, or to hunker down here and wait out the worst of the weather. "We can't stay here," Jacob argued. "There's no shelter, no protection. If a real storm hits, we'll be completely exposed. But if we push on and get caught in the mountains in a blizzard, we could lose everything," Samuel countered. The debate went on for over an hour, voices rising and falling, fear and pragmatism wrestling. It was Silas, sitting quietly at the edge of the group, who finally spoke up. "Storm. Coming," he said softly. "Big storm. 3, maybe 4 days. If we go now, we reach valley. If we wait, storm, trap us here. Many die." "How do you know this?" Samuel demanded. Silas pointed toward the mountains, toward the sky. "Sky, tell me. Wind, tell me. Birds, fly low. Deer, move to valley. Elk, already gone. Animals, no. They always know." "He's talking nonsense," Jacob muttered. "No, he's not," Robert Hayes said quietly. "Back in Ohio, we always watched the geese. When they flew early, winter came hard. Animals know things we've forgotten." Thomas studied Silas's face, searching for uncertainty or doubt. He found none. The boy was absolutely convinced. "If we go now, can we make it before the storm hits?" Thomas asked. Silas nodded. "If we hurry, no stop, no rest, hard travel, but can make. And if we stay..." Silas's face went grave. "Many die cold. Take old ones. Snow, bury wagons, food, run out." The decision wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. They would push on, traveling as fast as the wagons could manage, racing against the storm. For the next 3 days, they barely stopped. They traveled from first light until too dark to see the trail, eating cold food and sleeping in their clothes, pushing the animals to the edge of their endurance. The children stopped complaining after the first day, sensing the urgency. The settlers drove themselves harder than they had ever been driven. Silas proved invaluable. He could read the land like a book, guiding them around obstacles before they became problems, finding shortcuts that saved hours, locating water sources that weren't visible from the trail. He moved between the wagons, tirelessly, helping where he was needed. Rebecca stayed close when she could, watching as he navigated between his 2 worlds with increasing confidence. He would stop sometimes and tilt his head, listening to something she couldn't hear, and then make a suggestion that invariably proved correct. "How do you know all this?" she asked on the second day. "Forest. Teach me," he said simply. "Pack. Teach me. Watch. Listen. Smell. Everything. Or tell story. You just need... learn red. Could you teach me?" He looked at her with surprise, then something that might have been pleasure. "Yes, I teach you." On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and saw it, a valley spread out below them like a promise, with a river winding through its center and stands of timber. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was achievable. "There," Thomas breathed, relief palpable. "We're going to make it." Behind them, the sky had gone the color of old bruises, purple and black and swollen with unreleased snow. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp taste of the storm bearing down on them. But ahead was sanctuary. They reached the valley floor just as the first heavy flakes began to fall, and by the time they had the wagon circled and the animals secured, the snow was coming down so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet. The storm that Silas had predicted hit with devastating force. For 2 days it raged without pause, piling snow higher than a man's head, howling with a wind that seemed to have teeth. The settlers huddled in their wagons, burning precious fuel to stay warm, rationing food and water. But they were alive. The valley provided shelter from the worst of the wind, and the timber stands broke the force of the storm. Slowly, as the snow continued to fall, they began to understand that Silas had saved them. If they had stayed where they were, exposed on the open plains, the storm would have killed them. There was no question about it. The sheer force of the weather would have buried their wagons, frozen their animals, and taken the old and the young and the weak. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, and the settlers emerged into a world made of white silence and glittering cold, they looked at Silas with new eyes. He was standing outside Elizabeth's wagon, his face turned up to catch the weak sunlight that filtered through the dispersing clouds, and there was something in his expression, peace, maybe, or vindication, or simply quiet satisfaction. Thomas approached him slowly. "You saved us, all of us. If we had stayed, we wouldn't have survived." Silas looked at him, and in his dark eyes was a wisdom that seemed far older than his years. "Listen," he said. "Always listen. Land speaks. Animals speak. Sky speaks. You just need learn language." "Will you teach us?" Thomas asked. "Will you help us learn to read this land?" "Yes," Silas said, and his smile was small but genuine. "I teach. That is why I am Bridge. Remember?" As if in answer, from somewhere in the distant mountains came the sound of howling, triumphant and wild and free. And Silas, standing in the snow with the settlers around him, tilted his head back and answered, not with the voice of a wolf, but with the voice of a boy, learning to be human, carrying the lessons of both worlds forward. The sound echoed across the valley, and for a moment the boundary between civilization and wilderness blurred until they became one continuous spectrum, with Silas standing precisely at the point where they met, the bridge between worlds. Winter settled over the valley like a long, cold hand. The settlers worked with desperate energy to establish shelter before the worst of the weather arrived. They felled trees, built rough cabins, established hunting territories, and slowly transformed the wild valley into something that resembled the foundation of civilization. Silas moved between them all, helping where he could, learning skills he had never needed, how to swing an axe, how to notch logs for cabin walls, how to preserve meat for the long months ahead. His hands, which had been shaped by running and climbing and hunting, learned new patterns, new rhythms. But he also taught. He showed the men where the elk would come down from the high country when the snow got too deep, and where to set snares for rabbits and how to read tracks in the snow. He taught Rebecca and the other children how to identify edible plants even in winter, how to find bird nests and bee trees, how to read the sky for weather changes. And at night, when the work was done and the settlers gathered around their fires, he told them stories, not in the broken English he still struggled with during the day, but in a strange hybrid language that mixed human words with sounds that had no English equivalent, stories that the wolves had told him about the mountains and the valleys and the creatures that lived there. The children were entranced, the adults were unsettled. "It's not natural," Mary Tompkins whispered to her husband one night. "The way he talks, the sounds he makes, it's like he's not quite human." "Maybe he's not," her husband replied, not unkindly. "Or maybe he's something more. Does it matter? He's kept us alive." It was true. Without Silas's knowledge, they would have struggled far more than they did. Even Thomas admitted privately to Elizabeth that the boy knew things he couldn't explain, had instincts that went beyond anything teachable. "He's a gift," Elizabeth said firmly. "Whatever he is, however he came to be this way, he's a gift, and we should be grateful." But not everyone was grateful. Jacob Miller had never quite trusted Silas, and as winter deepened and the isolation began to wear on everyone's nerves, his mistrust hardened into something darker. He began to speak openly about the wrongness of the boy, about the way he sometimes stood at the edge of camp at night, staring into the forest, about the fact that wolves still howled from the mountains and Silas still answered them. "He's calling them," Jacob said one night when he'd had too much to drink, "calling them down on us. It's only a matter of time before they come for our animals again, or worse." "That's enough," Thomas said sharply. "Silas has done nothing but help us. Without him, we'd all be dead." "Maybe," Jacob said, his words slurring. "Or maybe we're all just being lulled into trusting something we shouldn't trust. Maybe he's not a boy at all. Maybe he's something wrong, something that doesn't belong in either world." The silence that followed was heavy. Several people looked away, unwilling to meet Thomas's eyes, and he realized with a sinking feeling that Jacob wasn't alone in his suspicions. Silas, who had been sitting quietly in the shadows, stood and walked away without a word. Rebecca moved to follow him, but her father's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Give him time," Robert said softly. But time was something they were running out of. The real crisis came in late December, when the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the cabin walls and breath froze in the air. Old Margaret Crawford, who had named Silas and who had been declining steadily since they'd arrived in the valley, took a turn for the worse. She couldn't get warm no matter how many blankets they piled on her, couldn't keep food down, could barely breathe through lungs that rattled with fluid. Elizabeth sat with her day and night, trying everything she knew, but they all understood what was happening. Margaret was dying, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. It was Silas who came to Elizabeth on the third night of Margaret's decline. "I can help," he said quietly. Elizabeth looked up from where she sat beside the old woman's bedside, her face drawn with exhaustion. "How, sweetheart? We've tried everything. Plant, in forest, high up, wear snow, not cover, make tea, help breathing, help warmth. Silas, it's 20 below out there. The snow is 6 feet deep in places. You can't possibly—" "I can," he said simply. "No way. Find Plant, come back, save her." "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "I can't let you risk your life. Give me name," Silas interrupted, and there were tears in his eyes. First one, make me person, not just boy, not just animal, person. I must help." Thomas, who had been standing in the doorway, stepped forward. "If this plant exists, if it can help, tell me where it is. I'll go." Silas shook his head. "You, not know forest. Not in dark, not in snow. You get lost. You die, no forest, no me, come back." The argument went on for another hour, but in the end they all knew the truth. If there was any chance of saving Margaret, if this medicine existed and could be found, Silas was the only one who could retrieve it. Elizabeth made him wear every warm piece of clothing they could find. Thomas gave him a knife and a length of rope. Rebecca gave him her mittens, the ones her mother had knitted. "You come back," she said fiercely, gripping his shoulders. "You promise me you'll come back." "I promise," Silas said, and he hugged her quickly, awkwardly, before turning toward the forest. They watched him walk into the darkness, his small figure quickly swallowed by the trees and the night, and every person there felt the same cold certainty. They might never see him again. The hours that followed were endless. Elizabeth sat with Margaret, holding her hand, whispering prayers and promises. Thomas paced between the cabins, his rifle in his hands, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Rebecca sat by the fire and refused to sleep, refused to move, just waited with stubborn hope. It was nearly dawn when they heard it, a sound that made every head turn. Howling, multiple voices coming from the forest, getting closer. The settlers grabbed their weapons and formed a defensive line, preparing for an attack. But Thomas, listening more carefully, held up his hand. Wait, listen. The howling wasn't aggressive. It was guiding, calling, leading. And then Silas stumbled out of the trees. He was barely conscious, his face blue with cold, his movements uncoordinated. But clutched in his frozen hands was a bundle of pine boughs, and nestled inside them was a plant with waxy green leaves and small red berries. He made it 3 more steps before his legs gave out. Thomas caught him before he hit the ground. "Get him inside. Elizabeth, hot water, blankets, now." They carried Silas to the fire and began the slow, careful process of warming him. His fingers and toes were white with frostbite, his breathing shallow and labored. For a long time, they weren't sure if they had lost him. But Elizabeth, even as she worked to save Silas, took the plant he had brought and prepared it exactly as he had described. A tea made from the leaves, steeped, long and strong. She carried it to Margaret's bedside and helped the old woman drink it, 1 small sip at a time. By noon, Margaret's breathing had eased. By evening, she was sitting up and eating broth. By the next morning, the crisis had passed completely, and Silas, wrapped in every blanket the settlers owned, slowly began to thaw. When he finally opened his eyes, it was Rebecca's face he saw first, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand gripping his. "You came back," she whispered. "You promised, and you came back." "I promise," Silas said, his voice barely audible. "Always keep promise." "How did you find your way back?" Thomas asked. "In the dark, in the snow, half frozen." "How did you find us?" Silas's eyes moved to the doorway, where early morning light was beginning to seep in. "They helped me, find me, lead me home." "The wolves," Elizabeth breathed. "They brought you back to us." Silas nodded weakly. "They understand. I need help. They give help. Because I am pack. I am family. Both families." That night, when Silas was strong enough to sit up and Margaret was well enough to join them, the settlers gathered for a celebration. They shared food and drink and stories, and for the first time since they had left their old homes, they felt like more than just a collection of people fleeing westward. They felt like a community. And when Jacob Miller, shame-faced and sincere, approached Silas to apologize, the boy simply nodded and said, "Fear makes people say things. I understand. Is okay." Margaret, sitting wrapped in blankets by the fire, called Silas to her side. "Come here, child," she said. Silas knelt beside her chair and she placed one gnarled hand on his head, her eyes bright with tears. "You saved my life, risked everything to bring me that medicine. Why?" "You give me name," Silas said simply. "Name is important. Name makes you real, makes you belong. You give me belonging. I must give back." Margaret's tears spilled over. "You are a rare soul, Silas. A bridge between worlds, yes, but more than that. You are a reminder that we don't have to choose between civilization and wildness, between safety and freedom. We can be both. We can carry both forward." She leaned down and kissed his forehead, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted. Silas was no longer the strange boy they had found in the forest. He was theirs, and they were his, and that belonging was deeper than blood. That night, as the celebration wound down and people began to drift toward their cabins, Silas stood at the edge of the settlement and looked up at the mountains. The howling came, as it always did, and he answered as he always had. But this time, when he turned back toward the cabins, toward the warm light spilling from the doorways and the smoke rising from the chimneys, he didn't look torn. He didn't look like a creature caught between 2 worlds. He looked like someone who had finally understood that he didn't have to choose, that he could carry both worlds within him, that he could be the bridge that allowed others to understand what he had always known. The wild and the tame were not opposites. They were partners in a dance as old as life itself. Rebecca met him at the cabin door, and she smiled at him with complete trust and understanding. "You're home," she said. Yes, Silas agreed, and for the first time the word felt completely true. Home. Behind them, the wolves sang their approval to the winter stars, and ahead of them, the settlers of the new valley began the slow work of building a life that would honor both the wilderness they had entered and the civilization they had brought with them. And standing between them, carrying the language of both, the wisdom of both, the love of both, was a boy named Silas, the bridge between worlds, the voice that spoke in the tongue of wolves and men alike. The Montana winter was long and hard, but they survived it together, human and animal, wild and tame, old world and new. And when spring finally came, melting the snow and bringing new life to the valley, Silas stood on a hill overlooking the settlement and saw both futures spreading out before him. The cabins and gardens and children playing below, and the forests and mountains and wolves running free above. He had been afraid once that he would have to choose between them, but now he understood the truth that had been waiting all along. He didn't have to choose. He could be both. He was both. And in being both, he had become exactly what the world needed him to be, a reminder that the boundaries we draw between ourselves and the wild places are not walls that divide us. They are bridges that connect us. And every bridge needs someone willing to stand in the middle, holding both sides together, speaking both languages, loving both worlds equally. That was Silas's gift. That was his purpose. That was his home.